Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Beatriz Cantata. I'm the Director of Engagement for Diversity and Inclusion in the Institute Community and Equity Office, also known as ICEO here at MIT. Thank you for joining us this afternoon on a rainy afternoon. So those joining us virtually, welcome. And of course, those joining us in person, welcome. Before we begin, we do have some acknowledgements. I'd like to thank Paulina Wolf, Alejandro Ramos, Molly McInerney, and Robert from AV for making this hybrid event possible. I'd like to thank the senior leadership support, Cindy Barnhart, our provost, and interim Institute Community Equity Officer, Professor Dan Hastings. We also have our faculty host for our speaker this afternoon. We'd like to thank Professor Robert Gibbons and Professor Ray Reagans, who's in the space joining us. Thank you again for your support. And also our speakers, colleagues from Sloan. So Sloan is his faculty, his host department. I'd like to acknowledge our current MLK Visiting Scholars cohort, many who are here joining us in person and some virtual. Jean-Luc Pierrit, Denise Frazier, I see you, yes. Christine Taylor Butler, who's joining us virtually. Tawana Dillahunt, also joining us virtually. Katie Donkor and Morgan Koenig. I'm seeing, did I miss any of our other scholars? So this is a great representation. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Note, we will be recording this session. A friendly reminder, please stay muted during the presentation. Live captioning is available. For those joining us virtually, lunch is on us. So Paulina will post in the chat function the Uber Eats voucher. You have about 3 days to avail of this lunch voucher. Subscribe to our newsletter, ico.mit.edu, if you'd like to hear more about our events and future presentations with our MLK scholars. Of note, our next event will be on March 13th, and that would be with Angelica Mayola Obregon. About our presentation, our presenter. Dr. Angelino Viceisza is a full professor of economics at Spelman College, research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and president of the National Economic Association from 2023 to 2024, and associate editor at the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. Dr. Viceisza's primary expertise is in behavioral and experimental economics with applications in development, household finance, and entrepreneurship. A significant part of his research has studied determinants of financial remittances, in other words, money that migrants send to family and friends in countries of origin. Dr. Viceisza has extensive experience designing and conducting field experiments in a variety of countries, included but not limited to El Salvador, Ethiopia, Peru, Senegal, the United States, and Vietnam. He obtained his PhD in economics from Georgia State University in 2008. He holds 2 masters in economics. That's 2005 in Georgia State University and 2004 from BU, Boston University, and an MBA in international business from Temple University in 2001, and a bachelor's degree in accounting from University of Netherlands Antilles in 2001. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Viceisza to the podium.
Thank you, Beatriz. Yeah, I have this one. All right, thank you very much, everyone. So, thank you for joining us today. Working. All right, on this beautiful day, thank you for joining us again. So thanks for the introduction and for having me here. So I wanted to start us off with this tour around the world at what I consider to be ground zero, which is Curaçao in the Dutch Caribbean. And that's where I was born. Curaçao is an island that has about 150,000 inhabitants and is still part of the Dutch kingdom. And the language that we speak there is Papiamento, which is closest to the Creole spoken in the Cape Verdean Islands because of the mixture between Portuguese and African. But we also speak some other languages such as Dutch, Spanish, English, and some people are basic in French. As Beatrice just mentioned, I got my Bachelor's of Science in Accounting at the University of the Netherlands Antilles, now called the University of Curaçao. And that's because the Netherlands Antilles used to be a fictitious country comprised of 6 islands. The so-called ABC Islands down in the Caribbean, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, and then the triple S's at the Northern Caribbean, St. Martin, Saba, and Stasia. At some point, the countries had a referendum and they decided to go their own separate ways. And then the university changed its name. So in the background of this slide, if you look closely, you'll see on the left-hand side, the northern coast of Venezuela and a red circle above it. That's basically where Curaçao is. And I pointed out because there's many maps where you actually will not find Curaçao because of how small it is. On the right-hand side, you see a very cute baby, and that's me, obviously, as I was little. So the story then continues with me doing different degrees, as Beatrice said a minute ago. I basically did my international MBA program at Temple University in Philadelphia, but it was international in the true sense of the word, where it started in Paris, France for 4 months. Then you moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for 6 months, and you ended in Tokyo, Japan for a month. So I found this very intriguing when I first heard about it. I completed that in 2001. In fact, remembering being in the airport on the day that 9/11 happened, about to travel back to Curaçao. In 2004, I did my Master's of Economics at BU across the river. And then I completed my PhD in economics at Georgia State in 2008. And I started my postdoc at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, in Washington, DC, which is where I really laid the foundation for much of the work I'll talk to you about at the beginning of this talk. So who am I thematically and methodologically? Thematically, I am a development economist that studies topics in household finance and entrepreneurship. And specifically from a methodology standpoint, I tend to use experimental economics in much of my work. So what that means is that sometimes I do behavioral economics as well, which is a little bit of psychology into economics. But from a methodology standpoint, when I say experiments, you should keep in mind 2 types of experiments. The first one are what people call lab in the field experiments. These are experiments where you bring people into a room much like this one, and you have to make hypothetical decisions, but that are incentivized. So people get paid for the decisions they make according to some type of salient aspect. And these experiments tend to therefore resemble the day-to-day environment in a key principled way. The other types of experiments I conduct are what some people call randomized control trials, RCTs, which tend to happen more in the natural day-to-day environment where people are making their decisions. And as I go through this talk, we'll see examples of both in these different countries that we are going to visit. The last type of data that I tend to collect are survey data to better understand what these experiments are telling us. So you might collect characteristics of people, right? Gender, race, et cetera, and then look at these interactions. So without further ado then, let's jump into some of these examples. And in so doing, visit these different countries in the world. And the story begins in Ethiopia, where we looked at the question of weather index agricultural insurance. So in the background of this slide, you see a group of farmers that participated in our focus groups related to this project before we started it. And what is the basic backdrop for this research that we did? It was the fact that agriculture is an important lifeline for many rural households, many of whom are relatively poor. But at the same time, agriculture and its productivity depend crucially on the weather, right? Specifically, agriculture tends to depend a lot on whether there's sufficient rainfall or not. So in this study, we were interested in if farmers have access to agricultural insurance, which is going to insure them against the fact that there may not be enough rains in a given period, will they behave differently in terms of the risky decisions that they make? So how did we test this? We set up a lab in the field experiment, the first type of experiments I tried to describe a bit ago, which you see on the left-hand side of this slide. If you look closely, you'll see me at the front of the room, very much like right now. And I'm explaining this experiment to the subjects who are sitting down, very much like students. And then my interpreter, Solomon, is in the middle of the room translating from me in English into Amharic. Okay, so that's what's going on there. You will also see that the subjects in the experiment have voting boxes around them, which is quite common in these types of lab experiments to avoid that people interact with each other unless that's part of the question you're going to study, which is actually an example I'll come to separately in a moment. On the right-hand side, you'll see part of the graphic we use to explain the experiment to people. And by the way, throughout much of this talk, I'll be skipping quite a few steps, right? It's not a presentation for each project specifically, so just bear with me. If you have questions, just ask them during Q&A. So what does the graphic on the right-hand side say? In our experiment, if you were a farmer here, you could buy 0, 1, or 2 bags of fertilizer in the experiment. And what we're interested in is whether if you have access to agricultural insurance or not, you're going to behave any differently. Specifically because insurance gives you this downside, right? Insures you against downside risk. You might be more willing to buy bags of fertilizer because it's essentially insuring you against the fact that you lose your money if you invest in fertilizer and then there's not enough rain, okay? And what we find in the study is basically that when people have access to insurance, they take these additional risks in terms of how they invest on their plot in the experiment. So it's, again, it's not a real day-to-day decision, it's a decision within this lab environment. We also find that last year's weather in the experiment has a very predictive effect on how you behave. And perhaps that's not surprising in hindsight, right? Because last year's weather is kind of telling you what you might expect as perhaps the payoffs to insurance this year. So it's shaping your beliefs about how you might behave moving forward. So this paper was published in the journal called Experimental Economics and was joint work with Ruth Vargas Hill, who was at IFPRI with me and is now at the World Bank. So the story then continues in Peru, Latin America, with a study on social norms. So when we say social norms here, what should come to mind are basically things like trust and reciprocity, okay? And we know that trust in day-to-day transactions is very important, again, particularly in rural areas where maybe tends to be less contractual, there's less reliance on taking somebody to court and so on. In the background, you're seeing me with one of our subjects. I mean, I have many stories I can tell about this gentleman alone. As soon as he arrived, he was a character. We immediately clicked. So I'll skip a few things, but if you want, ask me during Q&A. What did we do in this study? First of all, again, a lab in the field experiment, which you see in the background here. People are sitting there with papers. What did we ask them to do in this particular study? We had them basically play what is commonly known as a trust game. So I'm assuming many of you may not have heard of a trust game before, so let me set it up very briefly. A trust game is a game between two people, two players. Both of them have an amount of money available to them. The first person, the first mover, has the option to send some of that money to the second player. So you might be wondering, well, why do they have that option? Well, they have that option, and why might they want to do that? Because when you send money to the second player, it gets multiplied by a certain amount, it becomes more, and therefore the second player has more money available to them. So between the two of them, there is more money when the first person sends than when they don't, okay? Now here's the catch. The second mover may or may not return some of that money to the first mover. So if I send money to any of you in another room, I'm basically trusting that you will then return some of that extra cash back to me, because you could be like, I'm out, drop the mic and walk off with all that money, right? So that's the way in which this is a trust game. And when the second mover returns money, we call it reciprocity, because they're repaying the first mover in kindness, if you will, by saying, hey, you trusted me, I'm gonna reciprocate that trust, yes? So in this study, we use that basic structure to study what happens to social norms in environments where people observe each other's behavior. So if you look again at the graphic in terms of the lab and the field experiment, you will notice that here we did not have dividers, because we actually wanted people to observe each other's behavior in the room and see, therefore, what happens to trust and reciprocity, okay? And what we find is essentially that in an environment where people can observe each other's behavior, if there is information about the second mover and the second mover in particular, on whether they are trustworthy or not, these norms very quickly start to unravel. So basically, they break down. And they break down among people who are observing others not being essentially trusted. Again, I'm skipping a few steps here, but I'm happy to elaborate more during Q&A if you have questions. So this work was published at the Journal of Development Economics, again with Ruth Vargas Hill, and with another one of our co-authors who's Peruvian, Eduardo Maria. We then continue to contract farming in Vietnam. So to first of all set up what contract farming is, right now many of us are enjoying a meal. Some of these things may have been produced on some farm somewhere, and a firm has bought this by contract from those farmers, okay? So for individual small-scale farmers, contract farming is potentially a very lucrative way to make their living. But the flip side to that is that if as a small-scale farmer, you don't meet the conditions of the contract, that can be very problematic for the reputation that you build in the industry. So specifically here in Vietnam, we were working with dairy farmers, milk farmers. I don't know about you all, I was very ignorant with regard to how milk is produced before I worked on this project. I hadn't even thought about, things like quality of milk and so on. I know many people do, I had not. Quality of milk is very important in the delivery of milk. So when farmers are producing this and basically are milking cows and delivering it, there's a whole testing process that makes sure whether you have, right, grade A and so on, all these different quality gradients. So what we were interested in this project is what happens if you have a third party that certifies this milk, but can potentially collude with a firm and essentially tell the farmer your milk is lower than what it is. So we were interested in, does the third party always boost trust, or does it actually not always boost trust if the farmer essentially distrusts this third party certifier? So briefly on the background here, you're seeing one of our enumerators, the person who was helping us collect data, is walking by a motorcycle. And I want you to focus on the motorcycle there and the ones in the back, because you'll see canisters, which is what they use to produce the milk. Transport the milk on when they go from the farm to the contract buyer. So again, we set up a lab in the field experiment. So you see that on the left-hand side here, people are sitting there while we're explaining. The graphic that's in the middle, or if you will, on the right of this graphic, you're basically seeing a trust game that's being explained. And the trust game is, again, similar to the Peruvian case, with one key difference that here there were 3 players in the trust game, because there's this third-party certifier that we introduced into the mix, okay? And that is the certifier that could potentially collude with the firm to kind of say to the farmer, okay, your quality isn't quite what it is, okay? So what do we find here? We find a couple of things. The first one is that despite the potential for collusion between this certifier and the firm, farmers trust at equally high levels. So they have this idea that, we kind of trust the firm. If they say that's what the quality is, that seems to be what the quality is. And also we tested out some other experiments where we used essentially a lab in the field experiment to assess whether bonuses or penalties are better at inducing higher quality production. So basically, if we penalize you for having low quality versus we reward you for having high quality, do these things matter? And it seems like the carrot works better than the stick in this context. It's better to give people bonuses than actually to deduct when they don't do high quality. So this was published at the journal called Agricultural Economics with Christoph Zenger, Martin Keim, and Maximo Torino. Contract farming is a type of vertical coordination, right? You have a farmer that's collaborating with a buyer that's the firm. In Senegal, we actually looked at horizontal coordination. If farmers coordinate among each other and sell together to a large buyer, what happens? So in the background here, you see one of the women's cooperatives that we spoke to in Senegal prior to starting the study. And we were specifically interested in what are the potential costs to coordinating horizontally. If all of us here are producing peanuts, which is what these farmers' main crop was, right? The types of peanuts we eat buying from planters, et cetera. If all of us produce small amounts and we come together to sell this as one big bulky amount, ideally we can negotiate better prices and be better off. But as we know from interacting with human beings, it's not always obvious to coordinate groups of people. So we got interested into, can we construct an environment that is more conducive to coordination, thus leading to better outcomes for these farmers? So what is that environment? We now did 2 types of experiments. We did a lab in the field experiment, and we did a randomized control trial. Both were basically the same experiment, it's just the environment where we implemented it was different, because we were interested to see, does what we do in the lab essentially generalize to what we do in the field in the day-to-day environment? And what did we have people do? We created a coordination game, which basically mimicked what is known as a stag hunt coordination game. So again, I'm mentioning big words here. What's the basic idea? The idea of a stag hunt coordination game goes back in the day when people used to actually hunt. I mean, people still hunt, but I mean, where people relied more on hunting, right, for their day-to-day subsistence. You can hunt a stag. How many people know what a stag is? A big old deer, right? Which is not obvious to hunt if you're by yourself, right? So if you want to hunt a stag, you're going to be more successful if we go at it as a group. Versus if I hunt a rabbit, which is much smaller and much easier to do on my own, but you already see the trade-off. Payoffs for the rabbit are much lower, whereas a payoff for the stag are much higher, but there's also cost to coordination for the stag. So that logic applies to our farmer cooperatives. The idea being that if we sell together in bulk, we have higher payoffs to be made, but there's higher cost to coordination. If we sell individually, we sell to a trader that comes and picks it up, or we sell locally on a market. Great, that's easy to do, but there's also lower payoffs. Okay, so that's the idea of the coordination game. And then we introduced a very simple environment. We basically said, what if before people tell us what they're going to do in terms of their actual coordination, sell through the group or individually, we go around and we ask each of you, what do you plan to do? Okay, so we literally go and confidentially ask, what do you plan to do? What do you plan to do? And then we come to the front of the room and we anonymously reveal, this is how much people said they are planning to do. Here's the plan. Anybody want to guess what we find happens when we reveal the plans? Do people coordinate more or less? Okay, it's actually more, and it depends on the context. Because that's fine. I know I'm going through this quickly, so that's fine. But it's basically more because what we find is that having this idea that we're going to surpass the necessary threshold, okay, which is what the plans are indicating, is giving you a signal of how likely are you to be able to achieve the higher payoff. Okay, so I think why people are saying less is because it depends how much people have said they're going to contribute. So that's the point, right? But here we find that on average, essentially cooperatives are better off when they collect this information and reveal it, because more people are likely to coordinate in those contexts. It seems to be driven particularly in larger cooperatives, and the logic seems to be if you are in a larger group, there's more coordination that needs to happen. So revealing these plans kind of lessens the burden in terms of coordinating. Okay. Sorry. Exactly. So you're bringing the element exactly. So just because people online may not hear, Ray's point was the person who said less, maybe other people's peanuts are not that good, and you're hitting. Correct. So your point is that there's a quality element to this as well, right? So, and again, I said I'm skipping a whole bunch of steps, right? In a proper research talk, we could talk about all these nuances because there are some nuances. But on average, we find that revealing this information seems to boost coordination. But I think you're hitting some of the nail on the head there. So this was published at the Journal of Development Economics together with Tanguy Bernard and Kojo Aflaga. Okay. So now we start to enter the research work that is more recent for me, where I have more stuff going on currently. So some of my time during the past few months here at MIT, as well as moving forward, is going to focus specifically on these buckets. And the first one is the bucket of migrant remittances. As Beatrice mentioned in my introduction, remittances are the funds that migrants tend to transfer to families and friends in countries of origin, but it can also be communities of origin because it's not always just international remittances. My work has mostly been on international across-border remittances. And I have 3 different projects here. One that is already published, which happened in 2015 at the Journal of Economic Behavior, an organization, and a couple that are in progress. So I'm just going to give you the highlights of these different projects. So the one that was already published, the main research question there was quite simple. To what extent the way in which money is spent on the recipient side is impacting how much I choose to send as a migrant. So simply put, If I feel like you're gonna squander it away on alcohol and cigarettes, in my mind, maybe I won't send as much, right? Whereas if I feel like you're putting it in a savings account for maybe when I return, or maybe we're building a house or something like that, I might send more. So that's the very basic idea. How did we test this? Yes. I know I skipped that part, right? So briefly on the right, what you're seeing is a graphic that shows over time how much in remittances has gone to low and middle income countries compared to foreign direct investment and official development assistance aid from like the World Bank, right? And so on. And the punchline of that graphic, which is created by the World Bank, is that remittances surpasses both of those things. So it's an important form of social protection for poor countries. That's basically what the right-hand side is saying. Yes. You're welcome. So what we did in this project is we constructed an environment, again, with a field experiment, where we randomized you into one of the following conditions. Either you were in a situation where when you sent money, it arrives as cold hard cash, as tends to be the case with remittances, or you're in an environment where when you send money, it arrives in the form of grocery vouchers for the largest supermarket chain in El Salvador, because that's where we were looking at here, is US to El Salvador remittance relations. And we find an interesting effect because we have two additional variations where people are sending a lot of money and a scenario where they're sending even more money. So $200 versus $400. And we find that in the $400 condition, they actually prefer money to arrive more as cash than grocery vouchers. And when we do not back of the envelope, but back end questioning of why this might be going on, it seems like there's two stories. One is they feel like, okay, $400 in groceries probably is too much. So if we had had additional treatments where maybe the money arrives for a health savings account or for an education account, right? That might be a different story. We didn't have that because we didn't have the statistical power to do that. The other thing that seems to be happening, which is interesting again, is that even though it's a lab in the field experiment, so they are sending real money, but in an environment like this, it's not like they're walking into, a Western Union and sending it. People are integrating their decisions with their actual day-to-day sending behavior. So some people told us, well, I sent a couple of weeks ago, and because of that, I'm adjusting what I'm doing here. Which again, is not surprising, but it's an important artifact to take away as researchers when we're collecting this data, to keep in mind that they do, right, integrate with how people are behaving on the day-to-day, and therefore to collect those data so you can infer the right conclusions, okay? The next two projects, as I said, are in progress. The first one is a project where we are interested in the extent to which comparison websites impact people's remittance behavior. So what do I mean by a comparison website? How many people are familiar with something like kayak.com, orbitz.com, cheap tickets, and so on? It's something like that, but for sending money. So I want to send $200 from the United States to the Philippines. I go to this website, I punch it on there, and it tells me, here's all the companies you can send with, here's how much it's going to charge you, here's what prior customers have said about this company, right? And these type of attributes. So if you look on the right-hand side, you are seeing a snippet of one of these websites that has 4 companies and giving these attributes for each company. What we got curious about is, if you provide people with less information about these companies compared to what they normally see on this website, do they behave differently? And specifically, we were curious about what some people call the $200 and below market of consumers. These are people who send frequent remittances in the order of $200 to $300, so monthly or maybe even more than once a month. That amount is very significant in their household income. It's maybe anywhere from 20 to 40% of their income. But they are financially relatively less educated in terms of the general finances of things, right? So if you ask them the classic kind of financial literacy type questions, they may not score very highly, but they are very savvy in terms of how they usually send these remittances. And people have argued that this group, because some of them are more cash-based senders, could benefit most from these kind of comparison websites because they may reveal to them better companies they may be sending. Okay? I know, again, I'm skipping a few steps here. But we were curious, if we expose this type of a group to one of these comparison websites, what happens? And essentially, we're finding some very interesting patterns that revealing customer reviews to this group is what induces them to try out new companies. In other words, hearing from people who, if you will, look like me and go through my experience, and we're talking like, a rating on a website here. It's not like there's actual descriptions of these companies, seems to impact people in terms of trying out these new companies. And it seems to be concentrated among those who are, again, according to these metrics, less financially literate and more distrusting based on some generalized measures of trust, okay? The last project I have in this vein, if you look at the right-hand side, I'll set it up using that graphic briefly. Let's think of a recipient household where you are sending money to, right? So I'm sending money to some family in the Caribbean. That's what that little house is indicating, that recipient household I'm sending to. They work, so that's how they make part of their money. I send money, that's how they make another part of that money. And now let's say that household starts to participate in a government cash transfer program. So you might be wondering, what does he mean by that? So there are these programs that have grown a lot in developing countries over these last couple of decades, such as Progresa in Mexico, that many of them are conditional cash transfer programs. They are programs where basically the government says, if you send the kids to school, we're gonna pay you for that, for example, to avoid that you put the kids working on the farm when they really should be in school. That's what you should have in mind when I say these cash transfer programs. They don't have to be conditional, but several of them are. We got curious, what happens when this household in the Caribbean gets this new cash transfer to the amount that I send as remittances? Is it gonna crowd it out? Meaning I'm like, well, you're already getting this money from the government, I'm gonna send less. Or is it gonna crowd in more money? Maybe you say, well, we wanted to start that business, and now you're getting this money from the government. If I complement, we can actually do that, what we call lumpy. Or is it just, hey, it doesn't matter. I'm altruistic, I care about you, I'm gonna send the same amount of money no matter what else comes into the house. Making sense so far? So that's the project I'm working on. One of the projects I'm working on right now, we're collecting data from prior cash transfer studies and repurposing them to try and address this question, okay? So that's the remittance bucket. I also have some work on entrepreneurship in the United States, and if I had to summarize it, I would summarize it with the word Shark Tank. How many people have watched Shark Tank in the room? Okay, so let me still set it up because some have not. So the ABC show Shark Tank aired in 2009, nationwide, and it's a show where entrepreneur contestants pitch their businesses for potential funding by a panel of judges, which you see right here in the background, and they're called sharks. So I have two projects in this vein. The first one, which is already published at Small Business Economics with one of my former students at Spelman, Bailey Smith, basically looked at what happens to the companies that get funding on the show. So this was one of the most fun projects for an RA to work on because literally I spoke to Bailey, we sat down and I said, Bailey, you need to watch every Shark Tank episode, literally, and here's what you're gonna code in our variable Google sheet. And I have a couple of Spelman RAs in the room here, particularly Island, who's worked on me a little bit on this actually. So what we find there is that getting funding from Shark Tank does seem to make a difference in terms of survival of businesses in the long run, where the long run is more than a year. They are more likely to survive. And what we also find there is that there doesn't seem to be any racial or ethnic differences or gender differences in terms of who the companies are owned by, which we found a little bit surprising, but maybe it's because there's not enough women and racial ethnic minorities in the sample to begin with. Our next project, which is currently ongoing, is a media impact study where instead of looking at the people who pitched on Shark Tank, we're looking at people like you. In other words, I'm kicking back on the couch on a Friday night, I'm watching the show, and I'm like, I can do that. So it spurs you to start your entrepreneurial venture, okay? So that's a media impact study where we're combining Nielsen ratings with small business administration data and other data on outcomes. And we're finding that the show does seem to spur people down the path of entrepreneurship if you take measures like advice seeking at the Small Business Administration Center as your outcome. If you look at outcomes like actually starting a business, which we look at based on state registries or something like filing patents and so on, the evidence seems to be more mixed. And in some sense, we think that makes sense because it's no small undertaking to actually start a business compared to going in for some advice, which is much more lower cost, right? And kind of dipping your toes in the pond a little bit. And here we are finding an interesting effect where women viewers seem to respond differentially the more women are pitching on the show. How do we know that? Because we combined our old data with this new data, so we know who pitched on the show, and we can see whether women viewers are responding any differently or not. No such effects on racial and ethnic minorities. I also have some work on historically Black colleges and universities. This was published recently at the Journal of Economic Perspectives with Greg Price. In the interest of time, I'll talk a bit faster about this and the next bucket. The punchline is that historically Black colleges and universities punch well above their weight in terms of Black student outcomes. That's kind of the summary version of this paper. And perhaps that's even more remarkable when you take two things into consideration, that the data seem to suggest that the students that enroll, meaning Black students who enroll on average into HBCUs, are academically a little bit more at risk than the Black students who are enrolling into non-HBCUs. What does that mean? That they come from households that are more likely to be Pell eligible and also more likely to be first generation. So essentially, HBCUs are taking students who, according to those metrics, are slightly less prepared and bringing them up to par, and in some instances, surpassing Black students at non-HBCUs. That's the first remarkable thing. The second one is, if you look at historically Black colleges and universities financially, I don't think this is going to be a surprise to you in the room, but just in case, they have much less money than a place like this. So to give you a statistic, the top 10 HBCU endowments combined are about 10% of Harvard's endowment, just Harvard's endowment, okay? So again, for institutions that are so financially restrained to be doing so much for Black student outcomes, it is really remarkable. Okay. And in that paper, we cite a lot of other work, including in the review of Black political economy that has happened over the years that have shown different types of outcomes that get impacted by historically Black colleges and universities. And it's not just academic outcomes. The final bucket is on retirement preparedness in the United States, specifically racial and ethnic disparities in that. So if you look for a moment in the background of this slide, you will notice two lines that are trending upward and a couple of lines that are fairly flat. The lines that are trending upward are basically showing retirement preparedness, specifically retirement wealth at your age right before retirement for whites and Asians. And the ones that are trending flat are for Blacks and Hispanics. So that's the conundrum, that basically, specifically Blacks and Hispanics are ill-prepared for retirement, and people have argued, and we know this is true, that therefore they have to rely much more on Social Security in retirement, which some people call the great equalizer. So the first paper in this vein, which is with two of my research assistants at Spelman, Amaya Calhoun and Gabriella Lee, is forthcoming in the review of Black political economy, and we basically looked at the impacts that outreach by the Social Security Administration, by employers, could have on moving the needle on these outcomes. That's that paper. It was a lit review. And we have a subsequent randomized control trial, an actual intervention, where we're collaborating with the Understanding America study at the University of Southern California. And we basically do a mega information intervention over 4 weeks where we expose people to the following types of information. What is the importance of checking your Social Security statement every year and seeing how much you should expect to make in retirement? What is the importance of compound interest and thinking about small sacrifices today have very long-run consequences? I use my partner as an example. I constantly remind him that cup of coffee you buy at Starbucks every day is about $210 a month. Count that on a yearly basis, count that at compound interest over 40 years. That is basically a whole lot of money, right? So that's how you should be thinking about retirement. That's what we communicate in this. We also have an originally produced video where my collaborator, Luisa Blanco, and I speak both in English and Spanish on multiple of these issues. We bring it all together. We nudge you to discuss this with your family, your employers, your social network. And then we have you make a retirement plan. So envision your retirement dream. How much money are you going to need? What are the sources you're going to be able to rely on, right? And this really kicks things into gear. So we call this the My Retirement Project. The idea was to start online. And with subsequent funding, this year, we're going to roll this out in a small community sample and hopefully to then grow it beyond that. Okay? We don't have finance yet because we just literally finished the first wave of data collection. So it takes a village to pull all this off. And part of my village, as I said, is already here today. The students who collaborate with me in my lab at Spelman called V-Lab, which is both because some students call me Dr. V, as well as the fact that it's not a physical lab, it's a virtual lab. So that's why it's called V-Lab. So more than 35 Spelman students have worked with me in V-Lab since I've been at Spelman in 2012. And they've placed at a range of institutions, including MIT Sloan. So for example, Iselin is doing her MBA here now. Isoke, although not officially part of the lab, she took behavioral game theory with me, is now a pre-doc at Sloan. So at least 5 students that I'm aware of have continued on to complete their masters, MBA, Masters of Public Policy, Master of Science in Quantitative Finance, and at least 2 are on the PhD track for economics and finance. And I say at least because we're hoping people, right, come back and so on. So what else do I do? As you know, professors tend to also do quite a bit of service. So Beatrice mentioned some of these before. Last year, I was the president of the National Economic Association, founded in 1969 as the Caucus of Black Economists to improve the lives of minorities in the economics profession. So I'm currently immediate past president. And I'm also on the editorial board of the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. I'm a member of the AEA Committee on Queer Individuals and the Economics Profession. I have several initiatives with the National Bureau of Economic Research, Jim Poterba in particular, that is working on historically Black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions, building research capacity, and I'm happy to talk more about those during Q&A if you have questions. And then I also serve on a few other committees at the National Academies of Sciences, the University of Southern California, and also the University of Michigan's ICPSR. So in conclusion, I want to just do 2 things. The first one is collect some random thoughts that I've learned over the years going through all of this. And they are going to be random. It's not like a coherent story. It's just like, this occurred to me, that occurred to me. So, you know, just be ready for those. And then I'll thank very briefly some key institutions that have been pivotal in reaching these different goals. So in terms of the random thoughts, by the way, that's one of our best beaches in Curaçao. So if you ever go to Curaçao, let me know because you need to go there. Okay, that's the background. But the first random thought is life itself is random. Or as one of my faculty advisors always used to say, life is very non-random, right? Or sorry, non-linear. And that's important, especially for students in the room or those of you who are starting your career, right, in terms of grad school or beyond grad school, because it's easy to look at a resume or a CV and think that this person had it figured out basically when they were at the age I was on that first slide. And that's not how life works, right? I mean, we stumble, we fall. Some people have CVs of failures, and probably more of us should do that, right? All the things that became in between those achievements. The other thing is that Curaçao seems to mostly be known for the liquor. In case anybody knows the blue Curaçao liquor, that's where most people come at when I tell them I'm from there. Also a little bit for baseball, and for some in the room, Miss Universe, right? So the other third random thought is that, in my opinion, Peru has some of the best food in the world. It's probably too controversial to say the best, so that's what I'm saying, right? One of the best. The other random thought is it takes quite a while to do research. I mean, I admit to being slow, right? But I have projects that I feel like the more I go along, they're lasting 5 to 10 years from beginning to publication. And you know, when I compare notes with other people in economics in particular, that isn't always uncommon. So I think it tends to be one of these, you know, ideas that if you want to do research, particularly in economics, just be ready to do it for the long haul. The other random thought is that if I stay quiet, I can pass as Ethiopian. I learned when being in Ethiopia. I remember us finishing one of our data collection exercises. We went to a bar, grabbing a drink, and people walked off, and I'm just in there, and people walk up and start talking in Amharic. I don't know if you agree, right? But I would be, I don't know what you're saying, right? So So I'm more of a chameleon than I realized. Related to that, knowing multiple languages is a quite useful thing in life. I know that's obvious to say, but as a kid learning these languages I had on the first slide, it was just a burden and a cost. Like, why am I learning another language? In the long run, you're like, wow, this really actually pays off and it's quite helpful, you know? And then the last one, don't ever forget where you come from, who you are, and importantly also how other people see you. And this last part is important because we do a lot nowadays in terms of just do you, do what you feel comfortable with and all that, which is true. But life is also a game, and how other people see you doing you has implications for how they behave towards you, right? So just keep that in mind as you go through life and be strategic sometimes about how you navigate yourselves. All right, so who are the people I want to thank? Really institutions, because there's a bunch of people in the room who I have not listed here because I'm just thanking institutionally. The people who get a pass are my parents, of course. Without them, I would not have been here. They have both passed. Reni Maduro, who is one of my mentors, without whom the graduate school days would not have existed, because I didn't know what graduate school was until he said, have you considered grad school in economics? He has also passed. Freddie Curiel is a long family friend. He was my dad's childhood friend. And I mention him by name because he was the key person who brokered the relationship with the two individuals on the second bullet, Gregory Elias and Tyrone Alberto, who has also passed. These two individuals, without them, there would not have been my days at Boston University, because when I got admitted to BU, there was no funding attached. It was in those days about 40-something thousand. My father had a little bit, but could not afford the rest of it. So these people kicked in the money through their different programs. Then I went on to Georgia State, specifically my advisor, Jim Cox, Sally Wallace as well, and Reagan Petrie, who was basically my pseudo-advisor. She would have been my advisor had she not been that junior at the point she was at, because she didn't have tenure yet. So in addition to these people, I want to mention the United States Agency for International Development, who funded our Ethiopia work, as well as some other work. The German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, IFPRI, where I was for my postdoc, and the broader umbrella, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, CGR, that includes other institutes like the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines and several others. The National Science Foundation, the Social Security Administration, through the National Bureau of Economic Research's Retirement and Disability Research Center. The Carnegie Corporation and Rockefeller Foundation actually funded some Distinguished Scholar Awards at Spelman a few years ago, which were giving me some course releases to advance some of this recent work. And then, of course, Spelman College, the NBER, again, in its own right, the Boston Federal Reserve Bank, where I spent the summer in 2014, and many people don't realize this, including you, Jim, you might not be aware. Without the Federal Reserve Bank and me visiting here in that summer, I would not have really known what the NBER Summer Institute was, which meant I would not have come to Summer Institute, which meant that now I would not be a researcher. So like a whole lot of stuff came through that one summer here in Boston, actually. Duke University, where I spent my pre-tenure sabbatical. Stanford University, specifically the Hoover Institution, where I was a national fellow during COVID, so it was virtual, but I didn't have to worry about all of what a bunch of people in the room had to worry about, which was teaching over Zoom, right? And then finally, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, of course, the MLK Scholar Program, as well as Sloan, who have both been very generous. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions or comments.
So Angelino, I feel compelled to call you Dr. V now. I think it sounds so cool.
Totally fine.
Dr. V or Professor V, I think
it might mean I'll treat you like a student, but no, totally fine.
Thank you so much for such an engaging workshop. And I will tell you, this last slide means so much to all of us here, because you are right. Our success, it takes a village. There's not one person, it's not all our own efforts. So I appreciate you listing them down and acknowledging every single person along the way. I think that's a great insight for us here to remember. So I'd like to open up the floor for questions, both virtually or in person. So I'm going to ask Paulina, any comments, questions? How about in person? Please raise your hand and I will give you the mic.
Yeah, on one of the slide, Peru 2012, right? You said if you give money to one person and the other person multiply, can you clarify what that means?
Yeah. There I am. So basically, in the standard trust game, let's just use a concrete example. You give the two players each $5. And I'm the first player, you're the second player. So if I take my $5 and I send it to you, it gets multiplied times 3, and you get the $15 on top of your existing $5. So at that point, you have $20, but I have 0. And then you have a decision to make. Do you want to send me back any of that 20, or are you like, I'm done, I've got $20, bye-bye, I'm out. So that's the nature in which when I send you my $5 and it becomes 15 and you have 20, I'm trusting you with that money because, again, you have no reason to send me back any money. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Anything virtual? Okay, I've got a few in person. Let me start with Denise.
Angelino, thank you.
Thank you,
There's a
Denise.
lot going on here.
I know.
Thank you so much. I feel so full today. I actually have two questions. One of them is relating to your strategy, your approach to your research, because I'm getting a sense of the gamification of all of these different places. So my first question is, how did that gamification compare with maybe observations that you made in community dealings? Because I'm a different person, for instance, when I play dominoes versus when I don't play dominoes. And my second question is related to the vouchers and groceries, because I have a lot of friends in Cuba, and I know that sending grocery vouchers costs a whole lot more money. And so I don't know if that also applies to the Central American context, but that might affect the behavior. So I'm just wondering if you found that also in your research, the price of online grocery purchases is going to outweigh what it would mean for somebody to actually go into a store. And then, of course, you have the outdoor markets and stuff like that. So those are my two questions. And thank you so much. And I also appreciated the acknowledgement slide. I'm definitely going to do that when I have mine.
Yeah, so I'll try and do these questions justice in a snippet of a time because they're big questions. So I'll start with the second one, frankly, because I find it a bit easier to answer than the first one. So the second one is basically, what did we do here? I think all the questions you ask are great. The difference is that we played the role of the remittance sender. So let me clarify what we mean here. Normally, if you wanted to send money, whether it's to Cuba or another country, right? How I've done it is I literally walk into a grocery store like Publix in Atlanta. I know there's no Publixes here, but you walk into a grocery store. At the counter where you do, right, customer transactions, you basically say, I've got this $200. How much would it cost to send? You give them the money. The people go and pick it up in that country at a Western Union branch or something like that. Here, we, the researchers, had a contact in El Salvador, and we basically said to you in our experiment, if you send in this grocery condition, we will deliver it to your family and send you a picture of your family receiving the grocery vouchers. Why do I bring it up? Is because their cost was the same because we implemented it. So it's not as if there was a differential cost, and we wanted that because we didn't want part of the concern to be, well, if I'm sending. Now you're asking a much bigger question, which is, fine, that's how you implemented it, but how would it really look like in real life, and would that play a role, right? And I bet you it probably would, but at the same time, the benefit of potentially incurring the larger cost is that you feel like the money is stickier, so it's less likely to be squandered away on something, right? Like alcohol and cigarettes and so on. I should also say that in the way we implemented this, we deliberately, I mean, people could still game the system, but we deliberately had the grocery vouchers not be usable for things like alcohol and cigarettes. Because again, in supermarkets, you can potentially buy that too, but those were excluded from it. Now then there's the question about, right, in the supermarket, do they honor that or do they game it and so on, which is a different thing. On your first question, if I'm hearing it correctly, what I'm really hearing you ask is whether the approach that we used will generalize to other approaches of collecting data. Is that about what I think you're asking? For example, if we had used, for example, focus groups versus something like these games that we use. Is that about right? And that, I would think the short answer is, it certainly depends on how you collect data. What we try to do here is we have the games that we implemented, and we complement them also with the surveys. And before we oftentimes design them is when we conduct focus groups. Now, when I say focus groups specifically, I'm using that with a small f and a small g because that is not my wheelhouse. So when we say focus groups, we mean very much an informal, we collect, right? We contact like the village leader or the farmer cooperative leader. We say, can you bring a group of people together? Oftentimes we collect a few, so it's not like you're only your friends, right? And then we sit and talk to them to understand kind of what are the constraints you feel like are the problems here. And then we take those into how we design the experiments and so on. So we do try to have multiple data points so it's not all concentrated, for lack of a better term, in one bucket. But I think you raise a good point with any research, like how do we generalize to other contexts, right? Whether it's other research protocols or even other countries or communities, right? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Denise. Morgan.
Hi. First, thank you for a great talk.
Thank you.
So I have two questions. The first one is in the studies that you explained very clearly, do you take into account cultural differences? I mean, I can imagine that there are countries where cooperation or trust is part of the cultures more than others. So how do you implement that? And my second question is, I understand that you study poverty, but in all of your studies, I never see you looking at the global north, which I understand. But would you also want to do some studies in farming communities in the global north, a little bit as a control group to see if some of the conclusions are particular from the global south or if it is just common among farming communities?
So let's start with the second one. Again, the global north element in my current studies comes in, for example, the remittance work. We're looking at migrants who live here sending money. So it's in that sense that the global north comes in. But you're correct, the rural areas, or I should say farmers specifically in the United States is not an area that I've worked on. I would be happy to work on it. In fact, we started some discussions with the people at UGA where they have a big ag econ program, for example, a few years back. But as we all know, time is limited. So you end up going in the directions where, right, projects already exist and so on. But I think you raise a great point that poverty conditions are poverty conditions no matter where you are, right? I mean, and part of that is also related to this work on retirement preparedness in the US. Again, it's not farmers per se, but the idea is we're looking at specifically racial and ethnic minorities and how ill-prepared they are for retirement. And I didn't say this explicitly, but the sample we're focusing on here are low to middle income Black workers. Now, for now, low to middle income is based on this metric in this online panel, which is probably gonna be a bit higher income than low to middle income in the community. But that's where we started it out. And when we move to the community, for example, we wanna work in the area around Spelman and Morehouse, which is hugely and quickly gentrifying, right? But the West End itself has many communities where we would want to understand how are people really prepared for retirement, right? What is happening as homes are being bought and sold left and right? How are these property values impacting that type of a thing? On your question on culture, I think, again, it goes back in some sense to this generalizability question, and it's a great one. So I'll point to some other work, not mine, where we haven't done as much cross-country work, but there's a book that folks may want to check out, and the name is going to escape me, but it's something along the lines of 15 small village societies is part of the title of this book. I think Herb Gintis and these people wrote this book, where they did, let's say, trust games, but across a bunch of communities, and specifically communities that are very rural. Some of them were indigenous communities in, if I recall, I don't know exactly countries, but Latin America, other areas. And they try and look at, from a cooperation norms kind of standpoint, do we see similar primitives kind of going on? And as life normally tends to be, the picture is a bit mixed, right? In some cases, yes, things seem to generalize. In other cases, it really depends on, if you will, the specifics of that community. So yeah, no, I think it's a great question. Oh, Jim, yeah.
Angelino, I was hoping you could say a little bit about how the inspiration for these different projects came along, because I think for some of us listening, it's farmers in Ethiopia, it's remittances in El Salvador, it's cooperatives in Peru, it's the Shark Tank in the US, and just understanding where the spark comes from and how you think about which projects you're going to choose and which projects you leave on the side of the road and decide not to pick up and run with.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not great about leaving projects on the side of the road. which, is one of my, problems, right? Which is why you see so much going on. But broadly, the way I look at projects is in terms of the buckets, right? So to me, the core that runs through much of my work methodologically is experimental. As a result, not only am I a bit of a chameleon in real life, going back to the Ethiopia thing, but also in terms of my work, even when I was at IFPRI, I was collaborating with so many different groups, which is where a lot of these projects started, because they all wanted to do some type of experiment. And I just saw great questions in all of them, regardless of sort of the buckets that they are falling in, right? But broadly, the buckets are farmer cooperatives and agricultural economics, a lot of my older work, because that's when I was at IFPRI. When I transitioned to Spelman, I got much more interested in marginalized communities in the US, and specifically racial and ethnic disparities. And the remittance work kind of falls in between that. It's a household finance, looking at migrants and how they send back, and you could kind of put them in both sides of the bucket in a sense, right? They're here in the US, but they're connected to people in rural communities in these countries. So that's kind of how it broadly, right, relates. Entrepreneurship to me is a bit of not an odd one out, because farmer cooperatives are also entrepreneurship. It's just we don't think of them that way traditionally. I mean, they are basically taking products and you're selling them and pushing them to market. It's just not in the way that we think of them here. But I see entrepreneurship as a potential way to build wealth, which is how I started working on that topic, because it could be a way out of poverty in some ways, right? So, yeah, thanks.
We're about time. I mean, we're a little
Oh,
over time, 104,
over.
but I will take one more question from the audience, Jean-Luc, and then for those joining us virtually, any comments? Perfect. So one more question and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to go back to the HBCU slide.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the information that's on there, and just as a graduate of Dillard, I'm starting to think like, oh my goodness, I really do need to like be more active with my alumni association to kind of help with this current situation. So, but also thinking about like reflecting on my own life, like it took me a while to actually get to a point where I'm stable enough to actually think about actually giving back to my university. So thinking about alumni contributions to HBCUs, did you see like any trends, any ways in which students can perhaps at a earlier age like give back to the university?
Yeah. I almost want to kick it to you all, because I know, okay, go on, easy, because I know some of the stuff Spelman has been doing, but. A very small part, easily.
I feel like as an institution, that's one of the things Spelman does, start on a small scale for students as they're currently there, and then you build as you go. And I think, again, HBCUs, whether it's our faculty or professors, are about community. So when you have that access and when you're able to, you're ready to do it.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's helpful.
No, it is, because this idea of starting small, which there's actual great precedent for in a lot of the literature that has nothing to do with giving per se, right? Just as you build relationships, there's a long literature on starting small and therefore building on top of that. To answer your question in another way also, we didn't have, first of all, JEP articles, Journal of Economic Perspective articles, are not deep dives into data, unlike some of these other things. So for that reason, and the fact that we did not have great data on alumni support, but we talk about just anecdotally, because I see it at Spelman every day, I always say to their more senior colleagues at Spelman, many of you are professors, right? My colleagues, I say, without you all, this place could easily just plummet. I mean, they give in ways that other people don't give, right? It's not a 2017, it's the fact that I'm sitting there at 9 p.m. lecturing extras and right, like ways that people don't realize. And I think HBCUs have a lot of that going on with alumni that are giving in ways that you don't even see. So sometimes it's also not just the 2017, it's can I go back and, I don't know, lecture, right? Even if it's outside of the typical. So I totally agree with you. The alumni support network is key for HBCUs, at least if Spelman has anything to say about it. Yeah.
Snuck in one more question.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. First, I want to say thank you. That was an amazing presentation. I learned a lot. And if we could go back to the slide with the farmers and the insurance.
Yes. By the way, briefly, that's Spelman in the background, folks. I forgot to say that. It's a
yeah.
Founders Day, so if you look closely, it might even be Easlin in the regalia and stuff near Sister Chapel. Anyways, yes, the one about farmer in Ethiopia?
Yeah.
Yes.
I was more just curious to see if like moral hazard or adverse selection came up in this sort of like insurance. And then I also see that you use the word like prior year's weather as a proxy for beliefs. And I was wondering if you meant that in like a Bayesian sense.
Yeah, so both are questions I'm going to skirt by in some sense because we basically designed the experiment to avoid things like adverse selection and moral hazard. I actually was just sitting in on Ben's PhD course in IO where we talked a lot about these issues in health markets, right? So because they are complex in the day-to-day environment, in a lab, one of the beauties is that you can essentially design the experiment not to have that at least, right, explicitly. I mean, people may still have it in the back of their minds, but we avoided it that way. In the Bayesian sense of priors, we don't have a way to test, literally, if you will, are people updating their priors according to Bayes? I'm just using this kind of loosely here as your prior year's weather is impacting your beliefs about what the payoffs are going to be. But more interestingly, and if you're interested in this literature, there is other experimental work that has specifically looked at are people Bayesian in that sense? Like, are we rational in the way we basically adjust beliefs? And I know some of these terms may not mean much to everybody, but the basic idea is if I believe, I don't know, it's going to be, 30% chance of rain tomorrow or something, and for some reason you watch some weather report and it gives you new information, do you adjust that 30% to go lower or higher? There are rules and statistics about, right, what we would predict you do with that, and that's what we're talking about here. We were not that methodical about this, yeah, but it's a great question, yeah. Thank you, everyone.